So I would like to now hand the floor to the Rector of the WBAF Business School, Dr. Paul Doany, for his closing remarks before we close this session.
Thanks, Kevin. I deliberately didn't want to use my first 10 minutes because I didn't want to speak twice. And I obviously understand, there's a limit of time. So I would like to say that the old world, let's say, is the physical world. If we assume that the future is a digital world, which means you don't need to have a physical, necessarily, facility in itself. The old world of physical facilities like education facilities or places of work, by definition, are restrictive by means of access, which is physical. By definition, are elitist. The people who are perhaps more capable than others and definitely have higher affordability, not necessarily on equity basis. If you're living in a country and you're not living in the capital city, and perhaps the best university tends to be in the capital city or the largest city of that country, not only you have to physically move to that location, you have transport costs, you have accommodation costs, etc. So that adds a burden of cost, which again, therefore, by definition, means what? Only people who can afford will be able to get it. So the old world, by definition, couldn't provide equity. Okay? Now, the new world has the possibility of doing it. Now, the technological restrictions that we have been working on since I come from the communication world has gone through technological challenges in relation to meeting the connectivity requirement per person, which by definition cannot be restricted to a location because that person is not staying in the same place all the time, and therefore it requires fixed coverage and mobile coverage. And the second aspect of that is, what is that bandwidth requirement per person? What is the consumption in data that they need, the gigabytes that they need? And that number keeps going up. And luckily, more can be done. A third leg of that is latency. If you're doing stuff together, collaboratively, etc., then you can't have very high latency, which is the delay factor. And all this technology took time for it to be developed and distributed, installed. And if you take it down to the affordability level of the lowest income person in the country that you're in, that measure of cost means that that person should get sufficient connectivity. I have been speaking about this in my career for a very long time to very few people who could understand what I'm saying. Because what happens is that if you have 10 megabit per second and you want 20, the cost of providing that to those customers is at the expense of the ones who have no connection. The second part is the physical connection, which means basically cable infrastructure or fiber infrastructure, is by its very nature limited. Satellite technologies that have been attempted earlier, after all, some of you may be old enough to have heard of Internet in the Sky project, started by no less than very big people in the world today who have a lot of money and were not short of vision. But it failed. It failed technologically. Now we are on the verge of total coverage with real bandwidth, which is not small. And that means that the global access is now definitely possible within years, and it's affordable. That level of connectivity is finally approaching, okay? Then we come to the processing part, which means, devices. Smartphones are very, very cheap. I never believed that in my lifetime technology would develop to this level. And let me tell you that this is why I am actually optimistic that a person of very limited income can use a smartphone, which is sufficient for them to spend time to improve themselves. They don't need a lot of bandwidth. They don't. They need time and diligence. And that is what I referred to in the beginning, not working from anywhere only, but learning from anywhere. I think most of you know that you can learn from what is available to you. If in the old times there was a physical book, and that wasn't that long ago, and right now, with sufficient bandwidth, you can learn a hell of a lot from a screen only this size, okay? Which is, after all, what you're using all day. You got used to it. So I'm optimistic that the technology, the business models of providing this connectivity with sufficiency, okay? I'm not talking about the ones that are never satisfied with whatever you give them, right? Because obviously, if you're a business and you have to have, you know, like very, very low latency and so on, yeah, so you just provide it point to point, you see? You do it in one location. That's why 5G, for example, will by definition be spotty, coverage to the people who can afford it, and they should contribute to the people who cannot, which is the definition of universal service. So the exciting thing about the future of the world is that finally, every single person who has potential will be able somehow to afford to have a shot at it. Now, this is not about building startups and angel investors and so on, right? Because that constitutes a very small percentage of people. And many of those are going to fail. So those people who do that, we are telling them, lower your cost of failure by investing in yourself, right? So learn what you need to learn about. I was discussing with Baibars recently when this pandemic happened, and I discovered, in fact, that despite all the years of work and learning that I have spent, I graduated 1981. And if you discard the first 10 years of my working life, I have studied on average at least 2 hours a day of every single day, because I had to. And if I missed one day, I'll make it up in the weekend. And came this pandemic, and I was telling to Baibars, I have some time now, and I feel so weak on macroeconomics, and especially with this pandemic, I want to learn. And I've been looking around for online courses at that time, and I couldn't find anything, satisfactory to me. And I ended up having to just learn it myself. Let me tell you, 90% of what I did, was on a mobile phone. Some of it was on the computer. I didn't need more than that. I don't have very much bandwidth where I am. And it's doable. I'm talking about access now, access. What I did could have been done by anybody, frankly, living even in a village in this country, or at least in a town, okay? So the question is simple, really, and it's doable. Now, all companies doing what they're doing now, they will not be able to do it, what they did in the last 5 years, next 5 years, let's say roughly. They can't. Maybe 10 years ago, what you did 10 years before, you could do it 10 years again. Now, we know that you can't. Now, companies have to transform. They need to do it. They need to invest in their people to do it. And you're not going to get this thing from a conventional education center. Primary education is provided by institutions that exist. This business school is not in competition with that market. This business school is, in fact, going to be accessible to any person, affordable, and will be recognized. And I think, earlier faculty members have indicated the issue of certification and so on. In fact, I fully agree that that is not relevant to what this business school provides. It is recognition of that this quality of people who are trying to help. They're trying to help. And they've done it before. And this is not a conventional form of teaching. Every person here maybe have taught before, but the most important thing they've done is by working. And they've learned it the hard way. So what excites me actually about, going forward and what this business school can do is that this pandemic, unfortunately, what it has done is a very bad effect on economies and so on. And let's be practical. You're talking about connectivity. Governments are struggling now with stuff that is a lot harder. Okay, so the funding models for these things, and I spend a lot of time in my life as to how this can be done, okay, isn't even the mission of this school. Okay, but since I have been working on this and I know the subject very well, there's no harm. We can certainly help governments plan it. We can help operators plan it. We can help businesses, as some of our earlier faculty have explained to you, that if you're a business and you have to transform yourself, business transformation, if you're an SME, maybe you shouldn't be doing what you're doing, do it differently. Transformation. If you're a scale-up company, you're scaling up, you may need to transform, because if you're already a startup, you may need to transform 3-4 years into your life. Now, that is why every person and every company and every investor even need to invest in themselves. Now you have a bit more time than you did before, which is at least your commuting time, number one, right? But remember, please, always, there are people who have to commute. Somehow, the notion of people like us who may be able to work without commuting is very insulting to the people who have to commute. So I always remind people about that, okay? Maybe we are 30-40% max, by the way, but in most markets, we are around a quarter of the people who have this privilege that we are able to do what we do with much less movement, but the others need to move. Now, this is the part that I find promising after this difficult pandemic, is the fact that finally the technology has managed to reach to an affordable level of access by sufficient bandwidth, please, sufficient, because it's money. And if you have excess, then give to the one who needs, not to the one who wants to get more than they need. You see, it always comes at the expense then of the one who doesn't have it. The second thing are the access devices. Okay, that's broken. The next one, and some of the faculty members have mentioned the famous $100, all of us have been through those, $100 computers. They ended up costing more and all that stuff. Okay, but how many of us need processing devices? The number isn't that high. This definitely requires work. Okay, but it's promising. Okay, it's still a lower cost than we expected. So access and at least learning of a screen this size, and maybe a cheap type of a notepad or a whatever you want to call them, notepad, whatever they are, kind of devices. Even those in Turkey, for example, they can be bought for $150, etc. So it's not like the end of the world, and they can be shared. You can also buy them secondhand. That's the reason why, unfortunately, it took a pandemic to start with, to say you can work from anywhere, please. And if you can work from anywhere, you definitely can study from anywhere. And that is the mission of this business school. Thanks to you.